Thank you, Adam, and thank you very much to Stefan for those remarks. I must say it is very refreshing to have a European perspective. Australian criminologists typically find that our reading and our research is dominated by North American and British academics. So I'm delighted that we've had a little bit more information, and not only information but methodologies and results from a European setting. I must confess I'm feeling a little bit jaded this morning in relation to Stefan's figures on confidence and trust in institutions. I'm actually at 3 strikes at the moment. I started life as a lawyer, I'm a Protestant, and I teach media law to the press. So that's 1, 2, 3. Good thing I don't sell used cars, and good thing I wasn't elected to Parliament. But I think academics are okay, and particularly criminologists. I thought the first point I would make this morning would be to pick up on this issue of legitimacy, and that is that public confidence and public opinion, or strong public opinion of a confident nature, is not just important for political stability and confidence in the institutions, but the research in the last decade is also telling us it's very, very good for lower rates of crime as a crime control concept, or a crime control factor. And Stefan mentioned something of the work of Mike Huff and his colleagues, and of course the work of Tom Tyler has been around since 2006 in looking at legitimacy. And the single most important variable, say these persons, and of course the work is ongoing in Europe at the moment. They've gone across some 26 countries to try and replicate the work that Tom Tyler did a decade ago. But what they're finding, and certainly what Tyler said in 2006, was the single most important variable in determining why people obey the law is if they perceive the system to be legitimate. And if we're talking about the system, we are talking, I suppose, principally about police, but certainly about judges and other legal institutions, not just legitimate, but accessible as well. If you don't feel you have access to that system, then you'd be feeling less legitimate, less legitimated, and more likely to disobey the law. In other words, if you can make your system not arbitrary, not capricious, not discriminatory, and certainly not corrupt, people are more likely to obey the law. So it not only does this idea of having trust and confidence in the system lead to confidence and stability in your political systems and in your justice system, but according to the ongoing research, and we've got new surveys coming out now with Mike Huff and others in Europe, telling us and leading us to the conclusion that it should lead to lower rates of crime as well. And in fact, I'm intrigued that this focus on legitimacy is not being taken, I think, far more seriously by those people who tend to favour, particularly in the media, that somehow or other legal systems and lawyers in particular kind of get in the way of justice. You know, take yourself back to those kind of Rambo, Dirty Harry type movies where, you know, Rambo and Dirty Harry come in, a little bit of rough justice, shoot a few people, shoot a few drug dealers, and hey, that's the way in which it ought to be. And lawyers who might be calling for people's rights are just kind of getting in the way. As Doreen McBarnett said, and I was reminded of that just yesterday, due process is actually for crime control. Due process is not something that hampers crime control. It actually does the right thing in reducing crime generally. So, in fact, there's a scene in one of the Dirty Harry type movies where, you know, some robber has just been dispatched by the Magnum, whatever it is, the police would know here, the Magnum 44 or something or other, and this person, you know, gives out this little cry about, what about his rights? And, you know, Dirty Harry looks to one side and said, yeah, but, you know, what about justice? So what we're finding through these surveys and what we're finding through the legitimacy literature is actually telling us that a stronger role for the rule of law, a stronger role for confidence in political systems and justice systems and courts and police and defence lawyers, in fact, goes right across the board into improving people's likelihood of obeying the law generally. And that's, I think, an astonishingly important finding. I was just going to show you just 2 or 3 slides this morning in one aspect of that, and that's the aspect of people's opinions here in Australia in relation to sentencing. Sentencing is kind of the high end of it. Most people don't have too many interactions with police or justice systems, but everyone has a view on what they read in the press about whether or not a fair sentence has been given. So I've got 4 quick slides here that talk about vengeful attitudes. And it goes back to the time, this is from Tony Doob and Julian Roberts back in 1983. And in fact, I was at the University of Toronto Centre of Criminology back in 83 when Tony and Julian were doing this work. Volunteers were asked to consider a sentence given to an offender convicted of manslaughter on the basis of a brief news report. 85% said it was too lenient. When they were then given all the information that was available to the judge, only 15% said it was too lenient. In fact, 45% now said it was too tough. Now, that stuff goes back to Canada 30 years ago, and pleasingly, in the last dozen years or so, some Australian variations on that have occurred. The first one was the Sentencing Advisory Council back in 2006. You can see the reference down there. Karen Gelb was one of the main drivers of this particular public opinion. Their key findings mirrored Doob and Roberts, that when asked a simple abstract question, people believe that sentences are too lenient, but when given more information about the crime or about the offender, people's levels of punitiveness drop dramatically. They did a follow-up study 2 years later where they made these 3 points. When given more information, people become less punitive. People are more willing to accept alternatives to imprisonment, like bonds, sentencing circles where Indigenous persons might think about ways of incorporating their practices into what they're doing, and victims of crime are no more punitive than others. This was pretty radical stuff back a decade ago. Some really good work was done then by Austin Lovegrove in going into workplaces, and this was something that he published back in 2007. People were asked to impose a sentence after reading a case transcript. In 3 of 4 cases, in other words 75%, the median sentence imposed by the participants was less than the one handed down by the judge. So given all the information, people actually do have a lenient streak to them. In conclusion, citizens who are fully informed about sentences that are handed down in criminal cases are likely to be relatively content with those sentences. So it's about education, it's about information, rather than just going on the briefest of news reports. Another quick couple of slides. This was another article that Austin, in fact, just published recently in the ANZ Journal of Criminology, a follow-up piece regarding the respondents' attitudes. The conclusions: the public, on balance, are disposed to lenience. Don't believe for a moment, as many politicians do, that the public are actually very vengeful and they have to pander to that vengeance. But the personal conviction of the more harshly inclined was stronger than that of the more lenient respondents. So if you're going to be harsh, you're not going to be changed too often, which I suppose does come back to our political leanings. And finally, a study that was done by a whole bunch of people under the authorship of Kate Warner at the University of Tasmania, published a couple of years ago. This was interesting because this was actually surveys not of random people in the community, but of jurors who actually sat on 138 trials. And then they were asked about what they thought of the sentence when the person was found guilty. More than half of the jurors suggested a more lenient sentence than the trial judge imposed. Moreover, when informed of the sentence, because typically jurors are not involved, there's a sentencing exercise and the jurors are well and truly dismissed by the time the sentence is imposed, 90% of jurors said that the judge's sentence was very or fairly appropriate. Again, another instance that the judges are in touch. Each of those studies indicates that judges, in relation to that aspect of the system, are in touch. And so one can conclude the population is not as vengeful as we think. So to that extent, I think we do get that right. But what I find astonishing is that when elections roll around, the politicians come out thinking in order to win votes, they have to present a completely opposite view, which I find disingenuous. And those, Mr. Chairman, are my thoughts for this morning.